common way to approach most dungeon duties in Final Fantasy XIV is to simply pull as much as you can and then AoE it all down fast. In your average party, this is pretty simple, standard stuff. But among all the duties, there are definitely some where you may give a bit of a worried glance at your party as the big pull begins if you are not 100% confident in them. Simply put, some wall-to-wall pulls are much harder than others, or at least requires everyone to bring it just a bit more. I want to go over some of the craziest and hardest AoE pulls that you can do, and realistically might do, organized by expansion. By might do, I mean, while pulling the whole first room of Aurum Vale is something you could attempt, it is not something you would have any reason to do beyond just doing it for the sake of it, so that doesn't really count. I'll also attempt to organize the expansions in order from least difficult to most difficult, rather than just going from a Realm Reborn to Dawntrail in order. Now, remember, this is just my opinion of course, so do be sure to let me know what AoE pulls you find the hardest in the comments. Or, if you find no AoE pulls challenging, let me know which one you enjoy the most. But with that, let's get to it. Starting with Dawntrail. And an honorable mention. The first pack after the first boss Endwalker Zormor. This is a pretty normal AoE pull with just 2 packs. What makes it stand out is the 2 Warcore Bloodsuckers, as they have access to one of the strongest mob tank busters known to man, where a warrior can solo the entire dungeon doing big AoE pulls for every single section. These Bloodsuckers specifically need to be taken on their own, only to stand a chance of killing one before they overwhelm you. The rest of this AoE pull is just there as pack filler, you might say. For the actual hardest AoE pull in Dawntrail, the pull right after the second boss in Vanguard with those 5 floaty boys. Each of them can do a tank buster, and the tank buster is ranged. Due to there being 5 of them, it is perfectly possible for them to all combo blast you in sync, which can be overwhelming if the tank isn't already benefiting from mitigation. Similar to Warcore Zormor, this is also a pull a warrior cannot actually solo and has to piecemeal and split it up in 2. An unfortunate detail about Dawntrail dungeons is that there are not many spots where you are allowed to pull a ton, and the expanded toolkit makes a normal-sized AoE pull pretty manageable in a party. Notably, neither of these pulls are challenging enough to make anyone even flinch while doing these dungeons under normal circumstances. Moving on to Heavensward, Balzar's Wall. The AoE pull right at the start, which covers about 4 or 5 packs I would say, has a lot going on. The flying machines chain themselves to a player, pretty much never the tank, and damage that player and hound them around until killed. This forces the healer to split their focus. At the same time, the guardians in the pull include a variety of classes, among them archers, but more importantly, ranged mobs. The amount of enemies mean that actually getting the pull wrapped up rather fast is crucial to make sure the healer does not tire out. But because of the machines and the ranged guardians, it requires everyone to think about their positioning to make that magic happen, as everyone has to stack on the ranged mobs. I think it is also worth mentioning that as Warrior has raw intuition at this level, but Gunbreaker and Dark Knight do not even have Heart of Stone or TBN, the difficulty of this pull can be vastly different depending on what tank and what healer you have. I would also like to add an honorable mention for Heavensward, the pulls at the start of Zormor, which has the plants putting down exploding bombs throughout. These pulls are mostly challenging due to still being early in the expansion, so tools like Raw Intuition are not available. But similar to Balzar's Wall, the challenge comes from the splitting of attention these plants cause. This theme actually applies a lot, as AoE pulls in most of the dungeons in Heavensward have randomly a single ranged mob, or a mob that won't move at all, or a mob with some strange attack pattern, to really add variety to the pulls. However, the allowed size of the pulls really limit the true difficulty of these pulls, aside from Balzar's Wall of course. Next up, we have Endwalker. I want to start with the honorable mentions here again. First, the second AoE pull of Vanaspati, with the 2 Terminus Idolizers. What makes this tough is simply the amount of damage of their auto attacks, and a thing that tends to make the start of dealing with an AoE pull hard is when some of the mobs are fully ranged, as it means the tank has to start from much lower HP than usual, and these Idolizers do exactly that. They also do by far the most damage in the pull and have the most HP. However, this is one more of those cases where a relatively normal pull can be a little scary if your group isn't entirely up to the task. The second honorable mention is the second pull in Dead Ends. The long boys simply hit hard enough to be scary all on their own. However, again, this is a perfectly normal pull that no one even flinches at doing most of the time. What makes these honorable mentions is more that among all these normal pulls, they are challenging enough that they can pose an actual problem if the tank or healer is not bringing it. Now, the hardest AoE pull in Endwalker is the final pull in the Tower of Zod, which consists of 2 packs as well as a lone extra mob. But each of these mobs hit surprisingly hard. What makes this particularly awkward is that you can always split it up into 2 pulls, but due to how the pulls are more like a couple big mobs instead of a bunch of small ones, you can't really AoE well if you split it up, so splitting up the pull is too small, but taking it all at once is a bit scary for some. What can help a lot when dealing with this pull is the fact that what comes after is a boss fight, so the tank and healer can safely just empty the vault and use everything they have to survive, as you won't need anything until a bit ways into the boss fight where things should be coming up again. Now, you might think the scary mobs in this pull are the Colossi, or the big spider tank, but no, actually the problem is the rotor, as it has a no-warning, sudden tank buster that actually hurts. That's right, Return of the Surprise Tank Buster, just like in the Dawntrail section. Once again, for those that might have trouble with this pull, remember that you don't need to save anything for the boss, so meter out those cooldowns and expect to use everything you have. Moving on to Stormblood, we also start with an honorable mention, Doma Castle. After the first boss, there is this huge section with automatic cannons you need to avoid and so on. However, technically, you can pull all of it. The main reason why groups tend to stop and clear up on the way is that it can be difficult to really bring the heat while the pack moves, so instead of halting multiple times on the way, it is a lot easier to do the pull in 2 halves. Like, it doesn't really save very much time, so why bother pushing it? However, even if you were to pull all of it, the sheer length of the pull has a tendency to lead to some of the initial mobs being dead before you reach the end, making the pull a lot easier than expected. Now, Stormblood actually has 2 really hard AoE pulls, so let's start with the one in Bardam's Medal. The first AoE pull at the start of the dungeon, which consists of 2 packs, a single mob, and then 1 more pack, and that last pack comes with a bit of a walk, but unlike Doma Castle, because the first pack, the Helgai, are fully ranged, your tank ends up taking a ton of damage as they round up the mobs. Unlike the Tower of Zod pull earlier, because there is another nearly as big AoE pull right after it, you also don't have the freedom to drop everything in this pull, as it'll leave you short for the next pull. This does highlight an interesting detail that a really long hallway can make it easier to clean up most of the pull before it even starts, but the more ranged mobs in the earlier portion of the pull, the more problematic this selfsame property can be, which can make it difficult sometimes to clearly see what makes a pull easy or hard, as the exact same thing that makes one pull really easy makes another harder. The Bardam's Medal pull here at the start is also at a difficulty level where it is somewhat notorious for being scary, and also comes with an additional detail that sometimes comes up, which is that Bottom's middle happens to be at the exact level where the Heavensward Poetics gear stops being optimal, so players leveling jobs may find Bottom's middle a significant step up in difficulty over Shisui of the Violet Tides. The other really hard wall-to-wall pull of Stormblood is in Alamigo. After the first boss, you can actually pull everything up to before the second boss, and there are two parts to it. The first part is that the gorilla monsters have no warning tank busters, ain't that a surprise, but as you run across the open field, a large stampede of doggos come at you too. These doggos mostly just do damage, which makes the surprise tank busters from the gorillas a lot more threatening. To put it into perspective, a tank without any mitigation running can suddenly drop dead from around 30% HP if the gorillas decide to sync up their tank busters. Once more, the advantage of a pull like this is that what comes next is a boss fight, where you won't need a ton of cooldowns, so the tank and healer can just dump everything they have. Which then leads us to Shadowbringers, which has several honorable mentions, starting with Amarot. Any pull that has a roiler in it can randomly cause groups to have massive trouble as it latches onto the healer and reduces their healing output. So if you need that, this can cause problems if the team isn't working together. Both the roilers and the bombs that chase players also cause a similar problem as the one discussed back in Balzar's Wall, where the non-tank players suddenly have to help with stacking the pack, which for some players apparently seems completely outlandish. The second honorable mention goes to the mega pull after the second boss in Anamnesis Annider. Here, you can run past summoners that will summon extra mobs if you let them, which is often what groups will do. The fact the mobs don't follow can often confuse players that haven't done the dungeon much. And if you waste time second guessing, you will almost certainly have a lot of mobs remaining by the time all the summons come knocking. However, this is the last pull before the boss, so once again, everyone can throw everything they have. If you have a mage or a ranged job, a limit break here is also a pretty popular pick. The various summoned mobs coming in swinging with different telegraphed attacks can also be surprising. This pull is actually challenging enough that there are players that dig their heels in not wanting to do it, which is also part of the reason why it is an honorable mention. The third honorable mention is the first Giga pull in Pagaldan, and some of you might be thinking, what do you mean? It's like what, 2 packs? But if you go out of your way to help the dragon break the rock that bars your path, you can pull everything up to before the first boss. But the pull is rather long, so it is perfectly normal some mobs are dead before you get everything rounded up. At the destination, there will typically be 2 mage mobs that are at different positions, making the positioning challenging for the tank. But, once again, the next pull is a boss, so just throwing everything you have at it is optimal. Now, for the first actual hardest wall-to-wall pulls in Shadowbringers, we have a shared space for the first pulls in Holminster Switch, and I think I will give it to the first AoE pull. Holminster Switch being the first dungeon in the expansion means a lot of jobs are still missing certain additions they sort of expect to have in the expansion, increasing the difficulty. On top of that, the first pulls are about 3 packs each rather than 2. The first pull becomes the harder one in a planned situation, exactly because you need to save something for the second pull. Keep this in mind because some of you might think, nah man, the second pull is way harder. But that tends to be the case for those that actually didn't save enough for it. That is really what downgrades a lot of the full wall-to-wall pulls to be easier, because you can just full send on defensives. Not so much here. These kinds of pulls is exactly why my guides say to split up your big defensives like Rampart and the 30%, 40% in Dawntrail, so you have a big thing for each pull. The true hardest wall-to-wall pulls in Shadowbringers is also shared between 2 Mount Gold pulls. Right at the start of the dungeon, you can pull 5 packs as long as you keep moving up the mountain. The reason this is so manageable is once again because the next pull will be a boss. Which also means, in a really weird twist, that some might find that splitting this up into 2 pulls might be harder, since then you have to save some for the second half. Notably, what really makes this pull hard is that some of the mobs have telegraphed attacks and some have body telegraph attacks. Notably, the big bulky boys with the tail will swipe behind them, so you have to look at the huge blob of mobs to see that. At the same time, the Giga Pull after the second boss features 3 big packs. Overall, the mobs do more damage per mob, but what makes this pull scarier than the first one is that the Forgiven Prejudice, the Sphinx-looking creatures, will cast Punitive Light, which, while interruptible and stunnable, can be hard to catch in a blob of like 10 mobs, and while the tank doesn't really care that much, the Punitive Light does raid-wide damage, which can be quite threatening, causing raid-wide defensives to be relevant if you cannot interrupt and stun on time. Similar to Anamnesis and Niter, a mage or ranged limit break can be great here, but I have actually also been told some tanks like to use tank limit break here, specifically to protect the party, but sure, it also helps the tank itself somewhat. But indeed, what makes this threatening is a bit comparable to Balzar's Wall, where if things go sideways, the healer suddenly has to split their focus away from the tank. Which, probably to no one's surprise, leads us to the final category, a Realm Reborn. Before they put all those doors and walls in, and before we got a million defensive options. And once again, we have a few honorable mentions. The first one is the Giga Pull at the start of Zastasha. This pull is often touted as very tough because there's so many mobs, but the reality is that the length of the pull allows the group to clear up most of the mobs as they get pulled, and because it is a Realm Reborn, the tank can outrun the mobs in a casual jog, not even needing sprint. So as long as they keep running, you can safely pull everything, have someone tap the coral and spawn the boss, and just keep going. Granted, the other sections of the dungeon have big pulls as well, with some ranged mobs in them, but they are smaller than this Giga Pull at the start and has a similarly underwhelming result when it really comes to it. As long as everyone is attacking, Zastasha Giga Pulls are actually really manageable. The second honorable mention is the first pull in Aurum Vale. When done properly, you might pull a frog, maybe even 2, about 3 mushrooms, 2 plants, and maybe 2 jellyfish, and then pass around this wall here. The real difficulty comes from the specificity of this pull and how quickly it can go sideways. The fact it relies on a corner pull also means a lot of players simply don't realize how it works. But practically speaking, this is a normal pull. Which then leads us to, in my opinion, the top 3 of the hardest wall-to-wall pulls in Final Fantasy XIV. Number 3. Stone Vigil. The first Giga Pull. This includes the 5 packs and the boss. Not only does this pull include turning about 5 corners, which makes it tough for the healer, but the majority of the packs include ranged mobs, which, as discussed previously, makes the long corridors even worse. Once you reach the boss room, it is actually realistically expected that the tank has to still kite everything that can be kited just to survive, while the healer heals and the DPS AoEs everything. A key here is that this pull is so hard that you wouldn't do this with random players. You may even need to be sure your group contains the right jobs to cleave hard enough. Between the healers, I am relatively confident that Astrologian is easily the strongest of the 4 at handling this, thanks to all the cards and light speed, especially because Stone Vigil is situated just before healers get AoE and the barrier healers get Lustrate and Ryuholi. Number 2. Stone Vigil again. The last Giga Pull. After the second boss, you can pull all the 4 remaining packs, and also have someone open the door to the boss room, and pull the packs into the boss room and fight everything at once. What makes this pull so scary is that the ice sprites do so much damage at range. For many parties, just pulling 2 packs at a time is already enough of a challenge. This, of course, also means again that the tank has to kite everything that can be kited, just to give the healer a chance to keep them alive from the ice sprite damage. And finally, number 1, Zemail Darkhold, the Giga pull after the first boss. This includes the frogs, the ranged soul mobs, the biased stuff, as well as pulling the second boss itself. The souls are ranged, and the whole pull also includes a jerk anglerfish. Every duty in Final Fantasy XIV that has a jerk anglerfish always has a do something evil. This one in Zemail Darkhold applies a physical vuln to the tank, and yeah, with that on you, this pull just isn't going to work. And the tank is going to take a ton of damage, so the healer might just not have the time to fix it. Although, a barrier healer might be able to Ishuna in between Lustrates or Ryukolis. However, this debuff on its own gives justification to at least consider bringing a bard, just to have Warden's Paean, the only option to remove this debuff without a healer doing it. And, once again, the pull is so hugely massive that the tank almost certainly has to try to kite whatever can be kited, however much it can be kited in the boss room that is not that big. Additionally, the confusion induced by the frogs grabbing someone can itself be super threatening. And yeah, this pull, I don't think I've ever seen attempted with randoms. An odd thing with the Realm Reborn pulls is that they don't really have this same thing with, oh, and there's a tank buster in the packs, like many of the other sections. But instead, the pulls in Realm Reborn have so many mobs that whatever hits the hardest is actually the problem. Just their auto attacks. That said, what AoE pulls do you think are the hardest in Final Fantasy XIV? Do you think I missed some? Do you agree with my selection? Let me know in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Dawntrail, Astrologian's Lightspeed only had 1 charge, and at lower level, a much longer cooldown. Not to mention, the cards were all offensively minded from Shadowbringers to Endwalker, meaning that duties like Stone Vigil and Zemail Darkhold became much easier to gigapull for an Astrologian, specifically with the changes applied in Dawntrail.